A lot of INFJs report they've had a difficult childhood, and this is independent of all like traumatic things that might have happened that could happen to anybody. We're talking about the experience of being an INFJ. So this doesn't have to mean that you had to go through some traumatic events where, child services would have been involved. Even like if you had a very normal upbringing, just the fact that you're an INFJ child, there are a lot of things that could cause us trauma because we're very sensitive, because we react to the world differently, and because people very often are not used to INFJ children. And so all of that combined leads to some very unique INFJ childhood wounds that a lot of us struggle with. And until we actually tackle them, we will stay stuck in a loop. We will feel hopeless in many ways. We will feel like we'll always be misunderstood and an outcast, when in reality, once we're able to tackle those wounds, once we're able to understand, okay, what's going on here? How can I use this as a strength? How can I grow from this? This can be the biggest catapult in your life. A little disclaimer before we start. I'm not talking about real traumatic events. Those are things that most people cannot work through on their own. So if this is the case, please get professional help. But if you're like me, if you're somebody who's gone through childhood and knows that there are things that we have just buried down, and I needed to actually tap into this and transform all of this pain in order to get to where I am now, then hopefully this video will help you as well. Before we get started, I want to remind you, if you haven't done this so far, to download the free poster on INFJ Mastery. And if you want to take to the next level, either get the INFJ Energy Management course or work with me one-on-one. Everything you need to know you can find through the links in the description. Childhood wounds shape awareness. So as INFJs, because we're very sensitive, and I really don't talk about sensitivity being a bad thing, sensitivity is about being able to pick up a lot of information. And because we as INFJs are rather good at this, and our first function is introverted intuition, it has been our go-to tool when it comes to dealing with reality. And as children, as you all know, we don't want to be abandoned. We will find a way to accept the people around us, feel positive emotions towards them because we're in need of them. We're not able to psychologically and physically survive. So therefore, all of those wounds, all of those things that didn't allow us to actually be all that we are, made us become hyper aware. So we can very easily understand when somebody is being triggered by us. We know how to talk to somebody in order to gain their favor. We know how to create harmony, even if it's at the cost of us being ourselves. And this is the first thing we compromise very often. We learn from an early childhood on that if we want to stay connected to the people around us, caregivers, authority figures, whatever it may be, that we have to not only walk on eggshells, we have made it our responsibility to keep the harmony around us so we ourselves stay safe. Wounds build empathy. Because we've experienced so much pain, we actually have a lot of empathy for people who have gone through similar things, who've experienced pain on their own, and who've created childhood wounds through their experience. That in itself, of course, leads to us getting into friendship, relationships, whatever it may be, where we have so much empathy for the other person that we kind of allow the toxic dynamic to continue. Because we understand where the other one is coming from, we feel their pain, and it's sort of easier for us to focus on another person's pain and trying to relieve them of it than to actually focus on our own wounds. And very often this leads us to any kind of relationship dynamic where we continue to actually hurt ourselves. We continue to wound ourselves in order to relieve the other person of pain. But we have to be very honest with ourselves at that moment. We're also removing pain for ourselves. At least that's how it looks like at first sight, because we actually feel the other person's pain. We mirror that, we experience that, and we have actually conditioned ourselves to do that. Because again, if your caregiver or an authority figure in your life was in pain, then you probably felt it in a negative way. So we want to, on the one hand, make them stop suffering so we don't suffer like as an addition of that. And second of all, because we're so in need of not being abandoned as children, we actually have empathy for the people who tried to hurt us when we were children. Maybe not that exact person, but when we are in new situations where a similar dynamic is happening, we rather look at the other person as a former victim, somebody who's gone through similar pain as us, and not as the one who's actually hurting us in that exact moment. Wounds cultivate resilience. So, before we actually talk about how to handle all of this, we also have to look at the positive aspect of it, although it doesn't look like it at first sight. Having gone through those wounds, having gone through those situations, being able to actually hold ourselves up, this builds resilience. That's why so often you think of INFJs as martyrs. At least that's how it was, like, let's say 10 years ago. I actively work on changing that narrative because I don't want us INFJs to look at life and say we're great at surviving. Because we are. We actually really are great at surviving. I want us to become great at thriving. And this really requires an identity change. But before we even get to that identity change, we have to recognize that if we're able to survive so much, think of everything we could achieve if we're not living in survival mode. And this comes from our ability to be resilient. This is something that we learn because we had to go through life with those hardships, with those internal blocks, with all of those childhood wounds that told us internally, you can't do this, you're thinking too much of yourself, you have to protect the people around you. And we have taken responsibility for so many people's moods, experiences, and so on, when in reality, it wasn't our responsibility at all. Yes, it's good to help others. Yes, it's good to create a positive atmosphere. But first off, not at the expense of us being ourselves. And second of all, we still have to understand that this is, first off, a skill and not who we are. And second of all, that it's not a necessity for us to be a good human being, for us to be, a good friend, or for us to be worthy of any kind of acceptance or love. Because for the longest time, I subconsciously really thought if I'm not protecting the people around me, if I'm not, shining the light on them, if I'm not relieving them of their pain, then why would they ever want to be friends with me? Like, what do I bring into this relationship? If I actually focus on me, if I focus on what makes me happy, then, people will just fall off like flies, because then there's no benefit they get from me. Transformation into purpose. So once we've gotten to this understanding, the next step is to actually face all that pain. Because no matter how much pain we can take on from others, it still seems like it's easier than to face our own pain. Because facing our pain inevitably means that we have to deal with abandonment. We have to deal with, the fear of, if I show up for myself, if I do what is best for me, if I put me at the center of my life and I don't dim my life for anybody, if I know that me being all that I am will trigger people, because that's how you feel at that moment. If you think of, let's say, an abusive relationship, like a physically abusive relationship where everybody from the outside knows, okay, this is an unhealthy dynamic. Even at that moment, the victim in that situation feels overly responsible. They feel like if I leave them, they will hurt themselves. If I leave them, then I'm the bad guy. So we can't really rely on what our mind is telling us at that moment. That is a story that we have told ourselves in order to keep ourselves safe. But we're adults now, and it doesn't matter who hurt us. It doesn't matter who's responsible. We are now in charge of how we feel internally. And if we get a handle on it, life will actually become easier. It is hard to be in survival mode, and it's definitely harder than to be in the thriving mode. But in order to get into the thriving mode, we actually have to face a pain that we probably haven't faced to that extent yet. So no matter how much resilience I thought I had, I still was knocked out when I had to go through my, what I like to call the dark night of the soul. I have a video on that if you want to check it out. So at that moment, I really had to say, okay, let's really start from zero. If I have to choose myself, what would I do? I had to accept reality. I had to accept, what was really going on, not how I wish things would be. I had to understand that maybe nobody will get me, that no matter how much I want to be there for other people, how much I try to bend myself in order to create connection, that it's not going to happen. Like, it just doesn't work this way, because people who are in pain, they can't meet you. You have to start meeting yourself first, and there will be a layer of you that nobody else will have access to, and that's a good thing. And so once you really start that process, your childhood wound actually become the catapult for growth. There are a lot of studies that show that if you've gone through hardship, particularly in your youth, then you're more likely to actually create success than somebody who's never had any challenges. And that is not something we have to emulate, right? There's so many people who thrive to be successful or thrive to be known because they have to fill a hole within themselves. Like, that is, of course, not a healthy mechanism. But the truth is that if you actually have to face something and you have to overcome something, this actually gives you the strength to move forward. You want to achieve more because you know that you've been able to prove to yourself that you can get through anything. And so for me, really starting this process of building something on my own, and this doesn't mean you have to start a business or anything like this, but a life that is based on me creating an adventure that is based on how I want to see the world, and, really putting my stamp on my world and not being the one who always like goes into the background and only from time to time has like a little appearance here and there. But I say every single day, every single conversation, every single thing that I touch and that comes into contact with me will be based on how I want to show up, how I want to see myself. And that's when everything changes. So those INFJ childhood wounds, most of the time, if we're not like going into extremes that are very individual, they're based on fear of abandonment because we cannot be ourselves. Having learned that the best way to go through life is by being really sensitive to what the people around us want, how not to trigger them, because if we don't rock the boat, then people leave us alone. But with time, there's so much resilience that we build that people are not going to leave you alone until you actually start setting real harsh boundaries. And setting real harsh boundaries isn't so much about yelling or being mean towards others or anything like this. It's more so to know you have to show people actually where you start and what you're not going to compromise at all. You have to have a part of you where you say, I'm not going to keep the peace at all costs. And we have to be very careful when we really look at this concept of peace, because what we're talking about is external peace. What we want first and foremost is internal peace. That is something we really shouldn't compromise on. And it might mean that we have to create some chaos. It might mean that we have to create, tension in order to create that peace. Because if, for decades even, you've had dynamics that were based on you, making yourself small, you not thinking about yourself in order to keep the external peace, then of course, when you create a new dynamic, it will first cause rupture. It will first cause chaos. It will lead to some kind of external, argument one way or another. You're not going to get out of this by completely staying peaceful and not having any uncomfortable conversations with anybody around you. Awareness and action leads to growth. So as INFJs, what we have to learn is that awareness is not enough. Yes, we can probably acknowledge that we've gone through hard things in our life, like many other people as well. We can also acknowledge that because of our psychological internal makeup, our cognitive processes, certain things trigger us more, certain things have really caused us a lot of pain. They might have, made us become the outsider. They might have turned us into the black sheep of the family, an outcast, somebody who's constantly misunderstood, somebody who's weird, and is just on the edges of society in one way or another. But awareness isn't enough, because if awareness was enough, we would all just be happy-go-lucky and just say, okay, that's who I am and I accept myself and all is good. If that is the case, you probably have already put action into the equation, because we all know that we can't just stay observers. We are a whole human being. We're not just introverts. We also have an extroverted side. And for us as INFJs, this external side is about bringing action from within, meaning it's not about taking action on something that somebody else says we should do. It's about taking action from the things that matter to us most. So building an anchor, a representation, a bridge of who we are into the world. Yes, it's also about creating, service in one way or another, because we are relational beings. We want other people to feel good. And yes, you being you will in itself already inspire others. But it's not going to do anything. You're not going to be fulfilled if it all stays internally. There have to be choices in your life and actions that follow them that are a representation of who you want to be. Maybe you feel like I will never be the person I want to be because I have this idealized version of who I could be. I have this idealized version of the world, and none of it is equal to what is actually going on in society. But you can still take a step forward. You can still say, I can move into the direction of my idealism. I still can create a better tomorrow than, what is currently going on. And it doesn't matter if you share this with one person or 1,000 people. It really doesn't matter. But you have to start showing up as who you want to be. So that means making choices on, changing your job if you feel like people are not respecting you at that job. This means moving if you feel like you're living in an area that doesn't satisfy you. Maybe you live in a big city and this isn't good for your nervous system. Maybe you will feel much better living in the country. You don't know that. As INFJs, there's so many things that we sort of feel like we understand because of pattern recognition, but until we take action on them in the real world, how I like to call it in a way of externally observable fact, so you could actually tell this to somebody, yes, I applied to 5 jobs. Yes, I moved, cities. Yes, I had that uncomfortable conversation with my father. These things are externally observable facts. These things really happened. They're not just, oh, I changed my internal makeup, right? It's not just, oh, I see the world differently. When you combine awareness with action, that's when growth happens. And that's when you turn from survival mode into thrival mode. And that's when all of the resilience that you've built, all the empathy that you've built on the way, all the pain that you have faced, all of this actually becomes a superpower because now you have discernment. You know when not to have empathy for somebody. You know when not to get overly involved in situations where you're not allowed to be yourself. A quick thing I always remember is if I can show up as the version that I want to be, then I cannot help another person. If the only way I could reach another person is if I adapt myself too much, if I have to leave out who I am, if I have to pretend I'm different than I am because otherwise they're just not going to hear me, then this is a recipe for disaster. It always has to start with you being all that you are. This is something we talk about a lot when it comes to INFJ purpose in bootcamp. So if you're interested in that, we're welcome to join the hundreds of INFJs who've gone through this process and we're continuously growing. If you haven't done this so far, download the free poster on INFJ Mastery. Check out the INFJ Energy Mastery course. And of course, you can always work with me one-on-one. Everything you need to know, you can find through links in the description. And if you want to watch another video now that is in alignment with today's topic, then check out the video you see on the screen right now. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.